Hello everyone and welcome to our lecture on the first section in Unit 5, Revolutions. This section we're going to take a look at the Enlightenment. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so let's set the stage. Realistically, you're looking at three main ideals in the Enlightenment. There's individualism, freedom, and self-determination. Basically, think of, as Americans, everything that we've fought for freedom and what our country's built on. These are all ideals from the Enlightenment, and those you need to keep in mind, not just for here in the United States, but for what's actually going to happen globally in the period of 1750 to 1900, and even afterwards as well, with these ideas of self-determination, freedom, and individualism. But outside of the ideals themselves, we see challenges to monarchs and the church, and in particular, we'll take a look at this in terms of a bunch of different examples, but we'll look at it. Big example you want to kind of keep in terms of challenging to the monarchs and the church would be the French Revolution. And that leads us into our third point in setting the stage, is that the Enlightenment, as well as the scientific revolution, and even if you go back a little bit further with the Renaissance, they plant the seeds for revolution. And this whole unit, Unit 5, is known as the Revolutions Unit. And we're going to talk a lot about some. We'll mention some here today, as we already have, but we'll do a lot here moving forward to talk about revolutions, whether they're actual military ones or transitional revolutions like the Industrial Revolution. All right, guys, and then there's a key concept there. Enlightenment philosophies applied new ways of understanding and empiricist approaches to both the natural world and human relationships. They also re-examined the role that religion played in public life and emphasized the importance of reason. Philosophers developed new political ideas about the individual, natural rights, and the social contract. And that's what we're going to go through today, and in the activities that follow, what we're going to really focus on. All right, so let's talk about the idea of reason. And one of the first things you need to understand is empiricism, which is the knowledge comes from sensed experience. So you're not reasoning about principles provided by religion. You're more kind of working away from that. And in the Enlightenment, this idea takes off, but where does it take off from, or what's the center of the Enlightenment? That's the city of Paris, and that is going to be important later on in terms of when we actually connect the idea of the Enlightenment to revolutions, specifically with the French Revolution. Now, the critics and the people that are actually going to allow this to take off and push the Enlightenment, the ideas that we're going to talk about, whether it's empiricism or the social contract, they're going to be known as the philosophes. And you have these people that are being critical of the times and questioning ideas and questioning the actual structure of what's going on, and this leads to change. Now, a lot of these people believe that people could apply reason to everything. So you could look at it and say, okay, well, there's a reason behind this. There's something that we can actually understand or gain from these principles or these changing structures. Now, there are 5 core concepts you need to understand within the Enlightenment. Okay, 1 is reason. You need truth through logic and reason itself. 2 is nature. There's natural is reasonable, or natural laws, basically. Excuse me. 3 is happiness, so seeking your well-being. 4 is progress, so you should always be working towards improving yourself or progressing your country or whatever you're talking about specifically. And 5 is liberty. You should see the same liberties that are granted in certain documents, specifically the English Bill of Rights. And this is going to play itself out when we look at some of the other documents, such as the Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights here in the United States, or even the Declaration of Rights of Man when we look at the French Revolution. Again, these core concepts link back to these ideals of the Enlightenment. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit here some of the important thinkers and leaders of the Enlightenment period. And the first one's Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes was somebody that viewed that government was needed for order. And he actually argued the social contract. He said that people should hand rights to a strong ruler for law and order. So basically, you should give certain rights up to a very strong ruler so that there's order and law and organization within your society, basically so people can live. And he pushed this because he viewed that people were selfish and wicked, and this is why he actually viewed that the best government that actually existed was with the social contract for an absolute monarch. And we're going to talk about some absolute monarchs here a little bit later in this lecture. So he's not fully focusing on democracy. He's not even agreeing to that. He's just saying, look, you need to give certain rights so that there's rule there. And it's because he believes that people are wicked and selfish. Now, to take the idea of the social contract further, we have to add in John Locke. And he believed that people weren't as selfish and wicked as Hobbes. He believed that they could learn from their experiences and actually improve. And he believed that people had the ability to govern their own affairs, so be free, and do so in the greater wellness or greater welfare of the society. And he pushed the idea of the social contract by surrendering these liberties to protect the natural rights, specifically that all people were born free and equal with life, liberty, and property. And he favored self-government, so he favored democracy. And I want you to look at those life, liberty, and property aspects there that John Locke pushed as natural rights. They should sound familiar to you from the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the reason why it was changed to pursuit of happiness and not property is because of slavery, but there's a reason why that is included in the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson was taking it right from John Locke. Now, he thought that the job of the government was to protect these natural rights, and if you didn't do that, then the people had the right to revolt. Hence, again, let's connect it back to the American Revolution, people have reason, or at least in the idea of these natural rights. His principles combined with the ideas of Hobbes before him are the foundations for what we call modern democracy today. All right, so let's talk about the social contract just a little bit more. It's the sovereign or the government has the duty to carry out the general will of the people. Now, this sovereign can be a democracy or a monarchy. It doesn't have to be a democracy in terms of what we all talk about. There's a reason why it says sovereign. The people surrender some of their liberties, again, for the protection of natural rights. We've already talked about that. But there's this idea of a blank slate or a tabula rasa. Basically, a child is born with a mind waiting to be filled with knowledge. The reason why this is important is basically this contradicts the contemporary thought that your fate was determined on your ancestry. The idea that if you were born a noble, then you were going to be a noble. If you were born a peasant, you were going to be a peasant. The idea of tabula rasa in this social contract and this pushing of democratic ideas, excuse me, from the Enlightenment, means that you actually have the ability to improve yourself and improve your standing. And that's an important factor, and that will help breed this change and these revolutions. All right, next thing is laissez-faire. This idea was pushed by Adam Smith in his book Wealth of Nations, which was a response to the mercantilist idea of the exploration and expansion of the European countries in the New World and across the globe. But under this idea in Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith pushed that free trade was better, made it better for everyone as long as there was limited government. So the government only really stepped in to kind of make things fair or kind of keep things in line. He thought that businesses and consumers were actually guided by what was known as an invisible hand. So if you make choices in your own interest, you'll actually benefit society. And there's this an invisible hand that kind of moves the markets up and down, and ultimately they'll always kind of go back to center. Now, he focused on the idea of capitalism, an economic system where means of production are privately owned and are operated for profit. And if you take this idea of capitalism and the limited government and free trade and this invisible hand, this is laissez-faire, which means to let it go or let it do what it needs to do. Next thing is deism. So deism was the re-examination of their or people's relationship between God and humanity. And basically divinity set natural laws in motion but didn't interfere. So basically what this is, to make this simple, is that deism was kind of the pushing issue of questioning what religion's role was in the Enlightenment. So a couple more here in terms of some new ideas. We have conservatism, which is belief in traditional institutions favoring reliance on practical experience over ideological theories. So basically traditional institutions, and you need practical experience in that. There's the idea of socialism is going to come out. So a system of public ownerships and means of production. So cloth mills, land needed to mine coal, all this stuff. We'll actually talk more about socialism when we get into the revolutions, specifically the Industrial Revolution. So that we'll come back to a lot more. And then there's this idea of classical liberalism. So that belief in natural rights with a constitutional government and laissez-faire economics breeds that modern culture. And then you take that and reduce spending on armies and establish churches and so forth to kind of let progress and let the natural abilities of people go. And it doesn't mean that you get rid of armies. It doesn't mean that you get rid of religion. It just means that you take the actual system and allow it to develop more naturally within a democratic government or constitutional government. All right, now a little bit more onto some people here. We have Voltaire. He used satire to argue against the old ideals of the previous period during this Enlightenment age. He targeted specifically the nobility, which is here on the screen is aristocracy, as well as the government and the clergy. Again, he's looking at the other classes and saying, look, you need to come back and be more part of this society, and you need to give more to the people. He actually became an enemy of the French court. He was jailed and even exiled to England, and he's most known for fighting for tolerance and freedom of religion and speech. And he viewed, I think the thing that sums up Voltaire the best is this quote at the bottom of the screen is, I do not agree with a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. And this is really important because this sums up really the idea of the Enlightenment and how it pushes into the revolutions. Okay, and specifically when we get into the American Revolution, we talk about the rights that people want to garner, and you add in and talk about the Constitution and how it gets developed. Next person here is Diderot. Diderot was actually financed by a wealthy hostess, Marie-Thérèse Jaffrand, in France, and he is most notable for organizing articles and essays into what was known as the Encyclopedia. Now, this isn't an encyclopedia as you know it today, but that is kind of what it morphs into. But basically, he was organizing these articles and essays and publishing them so that they could help spread the ideas in the Enlightenment and educate the peoples of Europe on these new ideas and pushing against the French nobility and the church. And he actually even gets banned by the French nobility and Catholic Church because of his revolutionary ideas. Some other thinkers are Baron de Montesquieu. He believed that Britain had the best in government and was most balanced because of its constitutional monarchy and Bill of Rights. He believed in separation of powers, which in itself, when we talk about the United States, or if you guys have taken government, leads to the system of checks and balances. He's the one on the left there. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the one on the right, he believed that people had their individual freedoms, and he believed in direct democracy, so society should be guided by the general will, the general majority of the people, He said he did agree with the social contract that you do need to give up some freedoms for the common good, and that all people are equal and the titles of nobility should be completely abolished. And these principles are going to transition to places like the United States and France when they had their revolutions. And then César Beccaria, he believed that people should have the right to a speedy trial and should be held in jail for long, inordinate amounts of time, and he should say the punishment should actually fit the crime. So he's more in the legal system there in terms of Enlightenment thought. All right, so we're going to move on to some actually monarchs here that are going to be known as enlightened despots or enlightened absolute rulers. And these rulers embraced these new ideas of freedom and reform. And they understood that if they needed to make their country stronger and to make their own rule more effective, they could actually embrace these reforms. So one person is Frederick the Great, who's on the right. He was the king of Prussia. He actually granted religious freedom across his lands. He reduced censorship of the press and even improved education. The whole goal that he thought of the leader was to actually serve and strengthen the state. Even though he was a despot or an absolute monarch in a way, he was looking at it as an enlightened one. Serve the state and strengthen the state to better your rule. Now, Joseph II of Austria, he was the successor to Maria Theresa. He abolished serfdom in his lands. He granted pay to peasants and even granted freedom of the press, opening up some liberties to his people. Now, Catherine the Great, she's next, and she was the ruler of Russia, and she was known as the Great because of everything that you see on the screen. She was admired by the philosophers of the Enlightenment period because she was a very powerful woman and because she embraced some of the ideas of the Enlightenment, but also because she was a woman, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what the actual role of feminism and so forth that it plays within the Enlightenment here. Now, she favored the abolition of serfdom, which is important in Russia, even though she's not going to actually abolish it because their serfs are going to revolt and this is actually going to end some of their traces of freedom. So even though she's for it, because of a peasant revolt or peasant revolts, she actually goes against it. Serfdom won't actually be abolished in Russia until 1861 or 62. I can't remember the exact year, but it's going to be a while. But again, the peasant revolts are going to be something that we have to talk about a little bit later in why this actually happens. She's going to expand the Russian Empire to the Black Sea, which allows new wealth and new trade and aspects into Russia, which is important to kind of grow this empire. And she's even going to extend into Poland as well. And we'll talk about what that actually does again later on in this unit when we talk about the revolutions. Militarily, anyways. Here you can actually see these enlightened despots and who I'm talking about, with Frederick here ruling the lands in Prussia, Joseph here ruling in Austria, and Catherine ruling in Russia. All right, we have also some new styles in terms of actual cultural ideas, whether it's art, music, literature. You have a Baroque style of art that comes out, which is very grand and ornate. You have a new style of architecture known as neoclassical, which is taking the simple but elegant ideas and classics from Greece and Rome. In particular, you can see this all over Washington, D.C. This is an example of neoclassical architecture. You have Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. They emerge during this period musically. They have lighter, elegant styles. If you guys haven't listened to their music, it's beautiful. And then literature starts to begin progressing itself to develop into the more modern type of novel. You see tales of suspense and actually well-crafted plots and stories. And this is where you see in this period the first novels that actually come out. And breed life into what we know today. All right, now we're going to move into some more of our illustrative examples within this structure. I know this is a long lecture, but there's a lot within this section. So we're going to talk about nationalism and abolition of slavery here shortly or quickly. And just you have your two key concepts there. Nationalism also becomes a major force shaping historical developments of states and empires. We're going to talk more about that again within revolutions in the next section. And then again, you have the Enlightenment ideas. They're going to contribute to reform and expansion of rights. And you're going to see an expansion of suffrage, abolition of slavery, and the end of serfdom because of this. All right, so first let's talk about nationalism. Nationalism is the idea that humans are divided into separate nations, each with a distinct culture, territory, and also deserving of their own sovereignty. And this can be based on number of things within culture, whether it's actual race, language, whatever. And now, one of the reasons why this starts to come about is because foreign rule was actually viewed as something as very heinous before the 19th century. Generally, people had loyalty to clan, village, or region. But as the Enlightenment ideas come about, you see actually a development where people start to view themselves as a greater part of something greater, whether it's like the nation of France or the United States or Russia or whoever you want to talk about. Now, part of this is because science had actually changed the ideas of people, and the Renaissance changed the ideas of people, and the weakening hold of religion because of these new ideas and so forth, and the changing idea that people are towards religion allows this to take place. Another reason why this actually takes place, or nationalism takes off, is because of migration. People moving to cities become more educated, start to mix with other groups of people, and see other groups of people have similarities, or people moving abroad start to weaken those local allegiances to just clan, village, or region. And then the printing of materials starts to standardize religions, languages, so people have more of a connection and they can see themselves as French or German or English. And then nations start to identify themselves with a particular territory. So you take all of these ideas, you mash them together, and you start getting this strong sense of nationalism. This is going to play itself out not just in the revolutions of this period, but in the world wars and so forth, and plays a strong role all throughout the world today in many different forms. All right, so now we're going to quickly talk about the ending of slavery and serfdom. Really quickly on the idea of slavery is the idea of the Enlightenment and progressing through had really kind of started to chip away at the ideas of slavery. And you start to see slavery beginning to be abolished starting in the late 18th century. And this is going to kind of project itself out over the next century. So between 1780 and 1890, slavery is almost ended worldwide, at least the the direct idea of slavery. There's institutional parts that we can get into later that aren't necessarily slavery, but pretty much look like it, but that's neither here nor there, and that's for another time. And, slavery really starts to change and starts to get abolished because of these Enlightenment thinkers increasingly being critical of it and then gaining positions in government. And you see these revolutions take place, and then they start changing this. Now, serfdom, okay, starts to decline in Europe and worldwide because of the Industrial Revolution. We'll talk more about this later on in this unit. And partially because peasant revolts in the places that actually still have serfdom start to push leaders to reform. I just mentioned one earlier with Catherine the Great. And in particular, Alexander II of Russia, he's actually going to abolish serfdom in Russia in 1861 to kind of end this threat, or at least try to at least stave it off for a while. Now, the results of abolition are pretty straightforward. You could probably guess. You see that there's usually little improvement in the economic lives of former slaves because of this new system or class system that was put forth in the last unit with the systems of labor and stuff that were put in the colonies and of the European nations, where people are starting to be basically raised in status by their skin color. So it's not necessarily going to be, even though you get freedom economically, a lot of former slaves aren't going to take off and move up through society for quite some time. They're going to be highly dependent on forms of labor emerging, in particular sharecropping. And this is what I was getting at when I was talking about, even though people are being freed, they're going to be put into situations that aren't necessarily slavery, but for all intents and purposes, they are. And sharecropping is an example of that in the United States after the abolition of slavery following the Civil War and during the period of Reconstruction. Now, you're going to see there's an unwillingness of slaves to work on former plantations, which is going to lead to global migration, specifically in India and China, because we think here in the United States of just plantation slavery here. It existed in other places too, and you're going to see a lot of migration in India and China. You're going to see former Russian serfs remain impoverished, even though they technically are no longer serfs because of the economic system and lack of industrialization and so forth in Russia, because Russia's lagging behind in the ideas of the Industrial Revolution. We'll get to more on that later. And then few are going to gain anything that's going to be especially like political equality. And in particular, you're going to see this in the southern part of the United States, where segregation and racist reactions and Jim Crow laws and things like Plessy versus Ferguson are going to take place. And this is going to be more towards the end of the period, but still, remember, we're talking about the ideas of the Enlightenment, and these are illustrative examples of what comes out of it. All right, next is women's suffrage and feminism. So we're going to see demand for women's suffrage, or the right to vote, and an emergent idea and movement of feminism is going to start to challenge not only the political hierarchies that are existing in this time, but also the gender ones. All right, so feminism is a movement that develops in the 19th century, specifically in Europe and North America, because that's where you're seeing most of the education going towards women. And this is, even though it's going to be slow, they're going to transform this interaction between men and women into the 20th century. So women aren't necessarily going to be completely successful in this period specifically in Unit 5, but it's going to, all this stuff that they're going to do is going to lead to success in the next period, in the 20th century, where women are going to gain the right to vote. And then you're going to see an even more increased movement in this idea of feminism. And Enlightenment thinkers sometimes challenge the idea that women were innately inferior. So this is actually important, because this is what gets the feminism movement going off the ground, is that you see a challenge in the Enlightenment that women weren't inferior to men, whether it was by men Enlightenment thinkers or women. And this is a transatlantic movement spanning across Europe and North America. And there's an argument that there needs to be a radical transformation of the position of women, and this is where the feminist movement is based off of. Now, let's talk about some women here. So many of the philosophers actually viewed women traditionally. Not all of them, though, did. Not all of them, however, did, which is important, because this is what allows feminism to take off. But women, because they're seeing more articles and being more part of society, whether it's talking in the salons of Paris, which were basically just areas where you discuss things, not a salon in terms of like your hair. That's what they've transitioned to, at least the idea of it here in the United States. Anyways, but women start learning things and becoming part of the Enlightenment increasingly over time, and they start writing essays pushing for better education and equality. And one such person is Mary Wollstonecraft. She pushed for women to enter medicine and politics and in other fields that are important with education. And in her writing, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is an illustrated example you guys need to know for the test, she viewed that women should receive the same education as males so they could not only participate but also support themselves in society and become a functioning member of society and not be dependent on men. And women were probably the most important avenue to spread the Enlightenment ideas because they would discuss them in the salons of Paris or London or other cities. And just by talking, women push these ideas and allow them to expand. Now, further examples here with women, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in their Declaration of Sentiments, which you guys are actually going to read and do a reading analysis at the end of this week. They push that all men and women are created equal, that idea that's put forth in the Declaration, and that idea of equality. And they push for the right to vote, and that women should be able to hold office and participate in politics and manage property and manage their own incomes and be managers for themselves and be themselves, have ultimate freedom. And they really push for this. And this comes to a head at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 with the publishing of this declaration. And again, this is an important step in the feminist movement, something that you guys are going to take a look at and we're going to view and discuss. All right, so we're almost done here. We're going to talk about the legacy of the Enlightenment. The legacy of it is pretty much the world we live in today. Without the Enlightenment, we don't have all of this stuff. But more specifically, we start seeing writers examining the idea of divine right and questioning the ideas of church and state and what role they should play, and then where inequality existed and where it needed to change. And they encouraged reform. And they shape the Western world, and there's 3 long-term effects that you do need to know that come out of the Enlightenment. One is the belief in progress for individuals, the want for new discoveries and advancement, not just as a society, but for the individual, is important. Number 2 is the secular outlook, the worldly outlook. People openly start to question religion, and this leads to tolerance of other religions and other people and cultures. It may take some time, and we still may fight with this today, but that is a long-term outlook. And then number 3 is the idea of individualism. You use your own abilities to judge between right and wrong, and that the government should promote that individual welfare and individualism so that not only the individual person can progress, but the government can as well, and the nation can as well. And all these ideas are going to lead to the revolutions that we're going to talk about in this unit, whether it's the American Revolution, the French Revolution, or the Latin American revolutions, which are more, violent in nature, or more warfare-based, or we're even looking at the Industrial Revolution, which is more culturally and philosophically and technology based. So that's important. There's a huge legacy in the Enlightenment. You don't have the modern world today without it. All right, now we have a little bit of review here. This is up for you guys to do. I have a little essay practice, a long essay question practice. If you want to do, you can write it based on this prompt. You can explain how the Enlightenment affected people over time. And then you have 3 crash course videos from European history. They're really good. You can kind of look and reviews everything we talked about, but also brings in the idea of the scientific revolution, which is connected to the Enlightenment. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Have a good one.